think we can get started. So hi everyone, I'm Louisa Owen-Sandstrom, founder of Patternmaking Public Places. PIP for short is a project working to democratize access to pattern making skills by removing barriers of geography, economics, age, language, intimidation, and more. In 2019, we did free pattern making demos in public parks in all 5 boroughs of New York City. And this year, we're excited to welcome in a series of amazing guest pattern makers. So today is our 7th event of the 2020 season, and I'm honored to be hosting a conversation with the amazing Cal Patch. Cal Patch has been making, designing, and teaching all things textile related since 1991. She sews, crochets, embroiders, spins, prints, knits, dyes, and more. She designed clothing for Urban Outfitters, Free People, Gap, and Old Navy before developing her own line of one-off pieces called Podge, which she currently sells in her Etsy shop and sometimes at craft fairs. After owning a boutique for 4 years, which showcased her own and other local indie designers' work, she opened one of the nation's first craft schools in 2002. She contributes to books and magazines such as Stitch and Bitch, The Happy Hooker, Mend It Better, Applique Your Way, Made by Hand, Crochet Today, and So Stylish. In 2009, Cal relocated to upstate New York, where she is becoming a crafty farmer and growing her handmade wardrobe. She offers classes in the Hudson Valley and travels to teach at retreats and events like Stitches United, Squam Art Workshops, A Gathering of Stitches, and Lucky Star Art Camp. Her first book, Design It Yourself Clothes, Patternmaking Simplified, was published by Pottercraft, and you can see what she's up to at calpatch.com. This event is absolutely 100% free because we want to make these empowering ideas as accessible as possible. However, if you're watching now or in the future and feel moved to support Cal's work, you can purchase her book, which I would highly recommend, or take one of her classes. We're recording this as a live webinar today, but we'll make the video available afterward. In a few days, it'll be available at patternmakingpublicplaces.com and on YouTube. If you're watching this live, please feel free to submit questions or comments through Zoom or the YouTube livestream chat, and we will address them toward the end of this hour. So Cal, I'm so thankful to have you here. As you know, I've been a pretty big fan of yours for a decade, ever since picking up a copy of your book. It was what got me started down my path into pattern making, and I think many others may feel similarly grateful for the ways your work has contributed to their lives. So first of all, thank you. I guess we can start with the super basics. How do you define pattern making for people who've never heard of it?
Good question. Hi, everybody. How do I define pattern making? Well, actually, that starts off my mind thinking about a funny thing, which is that I always originally called it pattern making, but then nowadays a lot of people, or I tend to call it drafting or pattern drafting, because I think there can be confusion about the word pattern making, although traditionally in the fashion industry, it is called pattern making and the person who does it is the pattern maker. But so just in case that clears up any confusion about people, for people. So I just define it as making a sewing pattern, which could be for yourself or for anybody, but kind of taking the power into your own hands of creating the pattern, which is like a step beyond creating the clothing from a pattern that someone else made, which is a totally awesome thing to do. But the problem can be sometimes that whoever drafted that pattern, wasn't using your body. So even though the pattern, just like clothes we buy, is going to come in a range of sizes, none of those sizes might be perfectly suited to your actual body type and shape, because we're all different. So the cool thing about taking it into your own hands is that you're starting with your own measurements. So that's kind of my take on pattern making, but generally it would be anytime you're making a pattern from scratch.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. So often I'm trying to explain to people who maybe don't even sew, and I'm like, well, it's sort of the engineering of clothing, and they're like, I just don't know what you're saying. So yeah, that's a good way of explaining it. So actually, that might be a good place to start then. When did you first become aware of patterns and the fact that a person can make their own patterns? And what was the first pattern that you made?
Well, it's a long, interesting, I think it's interesting story. I don't know that there was like exact points, you know, the way you're asking the question as to how it happened that way. But I originally went to school for fashion design, where we learned pattern drafting, or pattern making, we called it. But we were learning it in a kind of abstract way, where we didn't really know whose body we were making these patterns for. And they gave us at the beginning of school these slopers, which are like basic patterns with no seam allowance. There's a bodice, a skirt, and a sleeve, I think is what we were given. And from those slopers, we would like rotate them around and stuff, and we made all our patterns from those, but we never drafted from scratch or used any particular person's measurements. So there was never really a person. It was more like you're making these patterns and therefore the garments for kind of, to me, they seemed like imaginary people. And then when we would have our projects and need to show them, we would try to find other students to be our models, and we would find a person who fit into the clothing rather than creating the clothing from the beginning to fit a certain person. So that was how it was like the whole time I was working in the fashion industry as a clothing designer, because the designers just came up with the style, and then we would write up what's called a spec, which was a series of measurements of like all the little parts of a garment. And we would fax it in those days over to another country. And like 3 months later, we would get a sample back. So the designer doesn't usually draft their own pattern. So still at that point, we were just sort of specifying the measurements and size of like a medium size garment. And then the production people would grade it into all the sizes. So fast forward about 10 or 12 years later, after I'd been working in the industry and started to realize that I didn't really want to work in the fashion industry for reasons that we may or may not get into later. So I kind of was going on my own, and so I opened that little shop that you mentioned, and I kind of realized like I had nothing to wear at the shop, because, you know, I had been working for these big companies and I'd been wearing the clothes from them, but suddenly I wanted to really represent my own style and my own work as a designer. So I realized I needed to make some of my own clothes, and quickly. So it was kind of at that time that it was funny because I felt like I was kind of cheating, but I had made up a sort of method where I just took some of my measurements, and knowing the basics of pattern drafting, I just sort of wung it and like started drafting the shape of a shirt or a dress based on my own measurements in a way that I had never done, and I had never been taught, and I'd never seen anyone else do. And like I said, at the time I felt like I was sort of cheating, and like maybe I didn't really get pattern making because all we ever did was rotate those slopers around. But like now, another decade or more later, I kind of think back and I realize that it's, you know, it's a very valid method. I mean, that's what my book is about, is how I draft from scratch. And I don't see it as cheating anymore. I kind of see it now as actually I developed a method for drafting patterns from scratch. And it's also kind of simplified from a lot of traditional pattern making because, you know, a traditional tailor can draft a pattern that's very specifically fitted to a body, and it might have so many measurements involved, like really specific things about all the different parts of a person. But the way I do it, it's actually pretty accessible because I feel like most of the clothes that we all really wear every day are actually fairly simple, partly because they've been produced hoping a wide range of bodies could wear them. But that's, even if we want them to fit better, we don't necessarily want styles that are super complicated and super fitted. I think most of us can agree these days we kind of like comfortable clothing that, you know, we want it to fit, but we also want it a little bit loose and not, we don't want like 16 princess seams and have it be super fitted through the waist and stuff like that, generally speaking. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you for that. And as somebody who also went to fashion school and had a good experience in many ways, I can verify that, you know, for a bunch of reasons, that is still how pattern making is generally taught, that, you know, you're drafting patterns for a dress form, you know, possibly even without arms.
Yeah, or legs.
Yeah, or legs. And to a certain extent, I think that's just sort of realistically what's possible, because there's, you know, 20 or more people in one class and one instructor, and that's a lot of different bodies to, you know, there's limited time and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But I love that you found a way that just makes so much sense and is simple, but it's also like true. I mean, I feel like a lot of times when things get really complicated, it's because the person explaining them didn't fully understand the core principle. And I feel like you start with that core principle so that you're able to explain it in a really simple way. Yeah, and you sort of started addressing a number of the questions I was about to ask you about your experience learning pattern making. So I don't want to overdo, but because I do suspect a lot of the people watching this are aspiring pattern makers and are learning pattern making in their own way, I'd be curious to hear, when you were in that classroom or those classrooms, learning in the way that it was being taught to you, which it sounds like you could already see that it wasn't exactly a way that made sense for you. What sort of a student were you? Were you resisting it? Were you just a good student following the rules?
I was very much a good student following the rules. And actually at that time, it didn't even occur to me that it was kind of a backwards process. And in many ways, like you said, it's logical that that's how it's taught. And also, when you're learning to be a part of the fashion industry, you know, you're not trying to make clothes for yourself, at least in theory, or any specific person. So it does kind of make sense that it's sort of abstract and generic. But it's partly because, you know, then years later, I had left the industry and I was more interested in making clothes for myself, and then later teaching other people how to make clothes for themselves. So I've moved more into the kind of DIY or craft world as opposed to the fashion industry. So I totally just lost my train of thought, but basically you asked it, what kind of student I was. You know, I was just totally into it, and I just did what they said, and I loved it. And we also spent many hours, you know, doing watercolor fashion illustrations with a live model, and I loved all of that. And it was just very much kind of an old school method of teaching fashion design based on how clothing designers used to work. Like, I mean, I think Karl Lagerfeld loves to just sit and like do a watercolor sketch and then hand it to his assistants and say like, okay, make the dress. But I don't think that happens so much anymore. Like, people like him might still be doing that, but people coming out of fashion school now or wanting to make clothes now, you know, that's not really how it works. So I don't know. I wish I could say I was like an anarchist, rebellious, like, you know, turning the system on its head kind of student, but I wasn't at the time. It wasn't till many years later that I started to see it from a completely different perspective. I don't know if I answered all the questions in there, but.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you were a well-behaved, rule-following, good student of pattern making in school and worked in the industry for a number of years, and then later found your way to this simplified but really effective way of pattern making, which to me, having read your book, having read a number of other textbooks, the way, and also having watched your Creative Bug classes, you have a very what feels casual way of you know, it's very non-intimidating and way of presenting these ideas and the method. And so I guess I'm curious where you think that casual way came from. Are you just sort of a casual person and you sort of approach things sort of in that way, or was there an experience that made that suddenly occur to you?
No, I think it's just very much how I am, but I would say I also kind of have embraced it because I realized that just the idea of pattern drafting sounds extremely daunting to most people. And, you know, it takes people a while to even be comfortable learning to sew and make garments. So that's a journey in and of itself. And then generally, I suggest people don't really try to learn to draft patterns until they've been sewing clothing for at least a little while. Because having an understanding of things like how a sleeve fits into an armhole is really helpful once you have to draw your own armhole and your own sleeve cap. So, which is not to say that most people who I find taking classes from me, they're definitely often not that experienced. They're often sort of what I call advanced beginner sewers. I usually say like you're totally qualified to take one of my classes if you've just sewn a few simple projects, even like tote bags and zipper pouches. You don't have to have actually sewn any clothes, but it definitely helps. The concepts will sink in a little easier if you do understand, like, what does a neckline look like? What does an armhole look like? So I again forgot what the question is, but what was the question? Oh, my casual style. Yeah, so I think it works well because, like you, I'm very much about making the idea of learning to draft your own patterns accessible and approachable. And my method, like, people I think are often kind of mystified when they come into my class about what they're even going to do. And, I don't really tell them what they're going to do. Like, I mean, they know they're going to draft a pattern and make a garment, but they often think that they don't know how that's possibly going to happen. And we just start walking through the steps. We start measuring the body and then plotting out some lines on paper. And before they know it, there's a pattern on the paper and they kind of can't believe it. So it actually is very approachable and doable. And I love that. And I've watched pattern drafting classes like on Craftsy where even I felt overwhelmed and intimidated and like, oh my God, I can't handle this. Like you had to take 100 measurements first and do all these like micro plotting. And for certain kind of clothes, maybe that is necessary. But for the kind of clothes I like to make, which are generally really simple to sew, the pattern drafting is pretty simple too. And so it's just sort of a coincidence that my casual style fits with my very approachable approach to pattern drafting.
Yeah, and thank goodness it does. Thank goodness it did. Yeah. Okay, so I have a question for you. I've done a bit of teaching of pattern making, and one of my little things that I always like to tell people is pattern making is both an art and a science. Science in that there are rules, a few of them to be learned and sort of understood, the principles behind it, and then an art because there's always going to be these kind of murky areas where no matter how hard you try to follow rules, you're going to have to kind of forge your own way, and also just room to make your own artistic decisions, make your own judgments. So I'm curious for you, how much in either your own pattern making for yourself or in teaching others, how much do you focus in on the sort of science and how much do you like to embrace the art?
Well, I would agree completely. I don't think I've ever quite put it that way, but I think you're totally right that it's a combination of science and art. And because, you're starting with certain measurements of the body, and I always start by kind of plotting out, how long is the garment going to be and how big is my hips and my chest and certain things. But then, as you said, there are some, you draw in an armhole and there's not a super specific scientific way to tell someone how to draw that armhole or that sleeve cap. Like I have a few kind of rules I can give, but to some degree, you just have to draw a curve and then we make sure that they're going to fit together. And it's kind of interesting how, like, I don't know that I could really break down, like, if I think it's 65% art and 35% science or something like that. But then there's also sort of an engineering factor and maybe like a physics, although maybe those are considered science. But like, when you're wearing a garment, you have to, or at least I believe you have to be able to move and be comfortable. And there's certain, necessary fit criteria. Like it's not just about it getting onto a body, it has to feel good and be functional too. So it's kind of like just a really interactive combination of the two. And it's interesting because, there's your body measurements are kind of a given, but then how much ease, for example, you want to add in the garment to your basic body measurements It's a very subjective idea because some people like things very fitted and without a lot of ease, and then some people like things with tons of ease. And maybe one day I make a garment that has very little, and another day I make one with a lot. But there's a lot of variables and a lot of interesting, murky, artistic factors. That then, to me, that's the fun part. Is sort of, and that's sort of the styling too, and the creative part of it is, taking the set parameters of your body or the person whose body you're making things for, and then how much fabric, how the fabric's going to drape around them and all that. Like, that's where it gets fun to me.
Yeah, totally. And actually, now that you mentioned draping, so your book is focused on pattern drafting, and I think most of your teaching is focused on pattern drafting, but there is this other way of kind of reaching the same final product, which is draping, kind of sculpting the fabric on the body. And I mentioned this when we chatted on the phone a while back, but in your book, I think it's this dress.
Yeah.
There are darts, and in order to find those darts, you counsel the reader to do something that I think is really smart, which I rarely see in any book, which is, instead of kind of guessing at those darts, at their placement and at their intake amount, using kind of mathematical good guesses, you recommend taking the draft up to that point, cutting it out quickly in muslin and putting it on your body and finding the darts, basically draping them on the body. And I just thought that was a really refreshing idea to mix the two, because draping and pattern drafting really are both pattern making. And if what you're going for is something that fits you in an intentional way, sometimes the most efficient way is to combine methods. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, or do you do much of the sort of draping in your classes? How do you see the two relating?
Yeah. I was glad you brought that up when we were on the phone, because I had totally forgotten that that's how I approached that dress. And then I'm glad you're bringing it up now, because interestingly, I don't actually do a lot of draping in terms of the from scratch, like what they often do on Project Runway, actually, like take a big swath of muslin and then just start, draping it on the mannequin into the vision. And I often say, like, you might need to do that when you're making a sort of more like a gown type of thing, or something with a lot of fabric that's going to need to behave a certain way. It would be really hard to draft that on paper and guess how the fabric's going to behave. But with the kinds of things I usually make that are a lot simpler, I feel like the flat pattern drafting is really to me, it makes the most sense as the starting point, at least. But then, so even though I agree that it's a good plan you can draft a very basic pattern and then put it on yourself and start, like, totally put the darts in that way, because until you've got those hills and valleys on the flat landscape, you are just guessing. So when I'm teaching, usually we draft the simple pattern and we do plot in a dart, but I always tell them that, we're not until we see this on you are we really going to fine tune it. And we often end up extending or shortening or widening the darts when it's on their body, because until that point, it is just a guess. So I still kind of use a combination, but I'm mostly about the flat pattern, just because the garments I make are pretty simple. And so drafting just doesn't, I mean, draping just doesn't feel necessary. But they're both good approaches. And I think some people's brain feels better with the draping, and it's a little more tactile and hands-on, kind of like sculpting right from the beginning. And to me, what makes sense is just to come from the flat pattern side of it. But I think basically they're like two approaches, and they kind of meet in the middle. And ultimately, you probably always have a little bit of a combination of the two. But I tend to come from the flat side, and other people might prefer that to come from the draping side.
Yeah, I love your response, and I completely agree. And yeah, I think so. It reminds me, there's this moment when I was in fashion school and we were in a classroom and somebody said, "When are we going to learn fitting?" And then the professor was like, "Well," and it was sort of like, "Not today." But one of our fellow students said, "Well, you know, fitting is draping. Draping is, I mean, you know, like the part where you put the fabric garment or raw fabric, either way, but the part where you put it onto your body, you know, you're using draping skills to fit, or fitting skills to, it's sort of the same concept of kind of manipulating and assessing the way it's working on your body." Yeah, and also the way I think about it, you know, you can draft flat and then you're going to need to stitch up a muslin, or you can stitch it up in nice fabric, but it's going to be an educated guess anyway, or you can do it in fabric first, but then you're going to probably want to transfer it to paper. So you're going to end up in the other place eventually.
Right. You end up with both usually.
Yeah. Would you say that there is such a thing as a perfect draft where you get all the right measurements and you get all the right angles and it's just perfect the first time you stitch it up? Or do you say it's never going to be absolutely perfect the first time?
Oh, I never thought about that question before. I mean, I definitely have many times where I draft something, or even students in my classes for the first time draft something and they try on the muslin and they don't want to make any changes. So I guess you could say that that is perfect, but perfect isn't really a word I like to use. And I mean, I also wouldn't really want to call it lucky, but you know, I think when we're going for kind of a loose casual fit, it's not hard to get there on the first try. Or most commonly, people just have like the slightest little tweaks, like maybe just the length, they want to lengthen it an inch or shorten it an inch, or you know, just have a little more room in the side seam or something simple like that. But I'd say we usually, because we start with our own measurements and then add a certain amount of ease, like we usually get pretty close to the end result we're looking for on the first try. And then the second version is just slightly tweaked from it. So I guess we get close to perfect the first time, usually, depending what garment it is and, you know, various factors, but.
Cool. Okay, so let's see. Where are we? So I know that pattern making is one of the things you love, but that there are other crafts and other skills that you also have delved deeply into, including crochet. And I'd love to hear if your pattern making brain and your crochet brain ever, or always, or sometimes kind of overlap. So I'm a very rudimentary crocheter, but the way I see it is that both of them are ways of clothing the body, and both of them require kind of a spatial and kind of shape awareness and some level of planning. But you're not, I mean, crochet, you can take one strand of yarn and, you know, cover the whole body, which is not the same as like cut and sew knit or woven fabric pattern making.
Mm-hmm.
So how is that relationship for you?
Yeah, that's kind of a really cool situation where, like, it's sort of like what we were just talking about with the flat pattern versus the drafting, coming from two different angles. Crocheting a garment is like, you know, you are creating the fabric from scratch, and generally you're creating the fabric in the exact shape of the pattern. You know, if you think of it in terms of like a sewing pattern, you're creating the fabric in the shapes to fit the body, whereas sewing is sort of, so crochet, I guess, would be called like an additive process or something. And sewing, you're taking away, you're starting with a big piece of fabric and cutting away the stuff you don't need. So I do think about that a lot because they're kind of opposite approaches, but I love them both. And I actually just in the past couple of weeks have been thinking about finally doing something that I've sort of thought about for a long time, but never was sure if I'd get around to it. I teach a class called Pattern Drafting for Knitters and Crocheters and Weavers, which is just sort of a simplified version of my classes, because I realize there are so many ways that people who are creating the fabric could use some pattern drafting skills to be able to bring those two directions together. So it's probably too specific to be of interest to most people, but it always bothers me that in a lot of crochet sweater patterns, they don't shape the neckline, like the back neck is not higher than the front. And so I've been trying to wrap my head around for years how to do that while working in the round, which is how most people like to create a sweater, like seamlessly. And I finally have just been thinking, you know, I just need to start making it in pieces, like what I teach in my pattern drafting for knit and crochet class, which I've been resistant to because it back in, I don't know, decades ago, most knitting and crochet was done in pieces. You would knit like a front, a back, and two sleeves, and then you would seam it all together. But people often really hated the seaming part, and often they didn't do it very well. And so the seams didn't look so great. And so the end result maybe didn't look so great. So then the past decade or two, seamless has kind of been all the rage. But then I kind of feel like I need to go back and reverse it again, because I really want that good neck shaping, and it would allow for all kinds of other things like better armhole and sleeve cap shaping, and just having more control over a lot of your fit issues. So I'm kind of always thinking about the intersection of those two things, and I think it's a good way to kind of inspire designs and problem solving, and that's all the stuff that my brain is swirling around all the time. I just often can't decide like what direction to go and what to actually do, because I'm very happy just in the swirling, imagining stages.
Yeah, that's really cool. And yeah, I thank you for sharing how you've been thinking recently about that kind of intersection. Which did you learn first? I mean, did you develop your pattern drafting mind first or your crocheting mind? Were you
Yeah, I didn't learn to crochet until I was about 30. So I was, which actually is around the same time I was developing my own methods of pattern drafting. But I learned how to do it technically when I was, in college. But it was not until I left the fashion industry and suddenly had more creative time on my hands that I really started exploring all the creative stuff I wanted to do, because anyone who's in the fashion industry knows you work very long hours and don't get paid very much at all. So it kind of kills me now that I didn't crochet at that time, because I traveled a lot. I was on the train to Philadelphia from New York quite frequently, and that was like a 5-hour round trip, door to door commute that I often did like 3 days a week. So I could have really crocheted a lot of stuff in that time. And it was before cell phones, and there was limited options of what you could do on the train. It was before, internet and Wi-Fi and all that stuff. So I do sometimes kick myself that I didn't yet crochet, but my mind was so consumed with my job, which I loved, and I didn't have a lot of time for like extracurricular activities.
Yeah, and I guess I'd love to hear a bit more about your experience working in the industry. You said you love it, loved it. You also said that at a certain point you were very ready to leave. I work in the industry, so I can kind of see, the good and the bad. It's complicated. And in addition to what your experience was working there, I'd love to hear how that makes you think now about fast fashion, slow fashion.
Yeah, those are big topics. And so, yeah, I did love my job. My main job when I worked in the industry was for Urban Outfitters, which at that time it was my dream job, and it was a very creative, not typical fashion industry company. It sort of existed in its own little world, which was Philadelphia. But we were really allowed to be super creative and kind of do whatever we wanted, because they actually kind of wanted things to be a little bit weird. So it was my dream job. Over the years that I was there, it became a little more business oriented, because they actually went public while I was there. And once there was like stockholders, they were less inclined to just have weird, kooky stuff that college art students would buy. But so that was when it started. And I started to understand the behind the scenes process more, of like how the clothes were actually produced, and just the fact that the people actually making the clothes were really not being treated very well, though it's really hard to see, because whenever designers or people come to visit, they're really good at putting on a show of like how great everything is. They turn on the lights when you come to visit, but then as soon as you leave, the lights are off, and all kinds of horrible things are going on, and people just aren't really being paid fairly and treated fairly with a lot of basic human rights and stuff. So I started to really see that, and see that the quality of the clothing was not great, and the costs were really high. And even though the business is paying a very low price to produce them, but then they're selling them for a very high price. And just that whole thing. And the years I was working in the industry, which was basically the whole decade of the 90s, was very much the time when production was being all shifted from United States domestic production to overseas, because the prices just couldn't compare. So that was basically the beginning of the whole fast fashion world. And although we didn't call it that probably for another 10 years or so. But yeah, so before there was even the term of slow fashion or the concept, I had seen that I wanted to shift in another direction. And, you know, I think the clothes that I make, I want to wear them kind of forever, like, or at least a couple decades. I don't want anyone telling me, you know, what you wore last year is not cool this year. And I started to actually realize that basically the whole fashion industry is sort of a scam, because they want to trick you into thinking you can't wear the things you were wearing last year because they're not in anymore. And that you need to get rid of them and buy all new stuff. And it's totally, you know, they've just created this whole, and we believe it. Like, we think, oh no, you know, bell bottoms or flared pants are last year. I now need skinny jeans. Like, we totally buy into it, and we want the new thing, and we don't, you know, the old thing looks bad to us. But once you realize that you're being kind of brainwashed into thinking that stuff, you take on a whole new perspective. And I think also, as you know, everyone in their teens and 20s like just wants to try all the things, and a new trend comes along that you haven't experienced, and you want to try it out. But then you start to realize what you like and what you feel good in, and maybe what looks good on you. And you don't want to keep changing it every 6 months. So definitely it goes along with making your own clothes, that you're also not going to want to throw them away every year. And it all just sort of lines up and feels synchronous. What is that word? That, you know, not believing in trends and making your own clothes. I mean, not to say some people who make their own clothes, you know, still follow trends and get rid of things and make new things all the time. But I move very slowly. I make things very slowly, and my taste changes very slowly. And that all works for me.
Yeah, I love what you said. And I think a lot about pace of clothing making, pace of clothing acquiring, but also as somebody who does sew a lot of my own clothing, I think a lot about the pace at which I make it, especially when I did start getting excited about 10 years in, start getting excited about pattern making. There were so many different skills I wanted to try, and so many different drafts I wanted to try, and several trash bags of clothing later, I realized I was not above fast fashion just because I was making it myself. So I think there is a lot to be thought about there.
Yeah.
And so I've come to the point where I actually like to hand sew my clothing without a machine, honestly, just to slow down. I mean, lots of reasons. It turns out it's an amazing set of skills. But one great benefit for me is that it slows me down, but still allows me to spend a lot of time making. But yeah, I think any creator of objects has to do some earnest thinking about, you know, the resources you're using, the products you're making, then what? Yeah. Anyway, we could keep going with that.
I know.
But I see that we're running out of time a little bit. So I know we have some questions coming in, and I just want to think if there are any more questions. So many questions, but that's okay. So you are standing in your studio, I believe. Yeah. And for people who are pattern makers or think it would be fun, I'd love if you could share with us what maybe one of your favorite pattern making tools is, or one of your favorite not official tools, but things that you like to use when you're making patterns.
I'm kind of I'm not really into a lot of gadgets and tools. So one of the things I really like about pattern drafting is that you don't really need much to do it. And most people probably have most of what they need in their house, but I happen to have right in reach, and that's just a pure coincidence. I do love an 18 by 2-inch clear flexible ruler. That's probably the tool that I always have. Like the hip curve is the next one, but that one I always say it's optional and no one should buy it until they're really sure they're going to be drafting a bunch of patterns. But that ruler, I mean, you can get by with another kind of ruler, like a wooden or plastic, wooden or metal one that you can't see through. But the see-through factor means it's really easy to do all your perpendicular stuff and, you know, corners. And so I've gone through many of them over the years, but I'd say that's my must-have item. So I guess it's my favorite.
Cool. Okay. Oh, one other question, and then I should stop hogging your time and we can share other people's questions. But you mentioned, again, when we were talking before today, you mentioned that people have asked you if you might ever consider starting your own indie pattern line. And I would love for you to talk a bit about your feelings on that and why.
Yes. Well, so yeah, people are always asking me if I'm going to start selling sewing patterns, or like I post a picture of something and they say, where do I get the pattern for that? And I have to explain it many times, but basically the sticking point for me is that you really cannot create a size range of sewing patterns that is going to fit everybody, because there's so many different, you know, not just sizes, but when we change size, there's different proportions depending on height and shape of body, and there's just so many variables. So a pattern, just like clothing at the store that comes in a range of sizes, is just never going to fit everybody. And you know, people who are experienced sewing, they start to learn how to adjust the patterns to fit their bodies. But I know the feeling of getting a sewing pattern and then figuring out that like none of the sizes will actually fit my body. Like I often have to do one size on the top and then 2 or 3 sizes bigger on the bottom. Sometimes none of the hip sizes, even like they're all too small for me, like even the triple XL. And I'm just a sort of in the middle of the road person. Like, what about all the people bigger than me? Like they would, you know, be very upset with this pattern. I'm very upset with this pattern. So I hate the thought of giving anyone those feelings from something that I sold to them. So that pretty much seals the deal for me. I just don't think I'll ever do it, because I just don't think it's possible to create a size range that works for everybody. And I just never want to leave anyone out. So I love that by teaching people to draft from scratch, it automatically is going to fit.
Great answer. You should all make your own patterns. And Cal can teach you how. Okay, so we can migrate over to people's questions a little bit. So Rebecca asks, can you talk about the smock you are wearing? Are those appliques or did you piece in the ribbon?
So yeah, this, I don't know, shirt, garment, smock thing I'm wearing, if you follow me on Instagram, you may have seen it in the works for quite a long time, because it was my 100-day project. I was doing 100 days of hand-stitched clothing, which just meant all one piece of clothing. Some people were like, you're going to make 100 pieces of clothing in 100 days. And that was never the plan. But so it is all applique. It's needle turned applique is the technique, which I recently learned because I'm making a quilt that is designed by Carolyn Friedlander, who I'm a big fangirl of. And so I learned this technique. I guess I kind of knew it. I just didn't know that it was like a thing. But it's cool because so it's all hand stitched and you don't see any of the stitching. It's all blind stitching. So I kind of liked the idea that you could sort of decorate and create a kind of print with fabric. And so, yeah, there's all these funny, here, I can put it down a little bit. So, and I kind of just used all these pieces that were already cut out from another project I was doing. I had all these cool shaped scraps and I really just used the scraps as they were, and didn't really cut anything out specifically for this shirt. So yeah, this is the first unveiling of it, the finished garment, which people have been rather eager to see. But I need to do like a real photo shoot, which I just haven't quite gotten around to yet.
Beautiful. I'm so glad that Rebecca asked, because that is gorgeous. And I think we were all wondering. Okay, Paula is asking, can you touch on your thoughts on vintage and reworking clothing that already exists? The vintage market is booming and growing, and it also addresses some of the scam about the fashion industry. I think that's an awesome question, and I think it's can be entirely related to pattern drafting as well. I think those skills and those materials can combine. What are your thoughts, Cal?
I have many thoughts about that. And yes, that is an excellent place to start, or not even to start, but to, it's an excellent resource for fabric and for learning about patterns and garment construction, because you can get something from a thrift store, either just to use the fabric, like, you know, there's a lot of skirts that you can find that have 2 or 3 yards of fabric in them. Or you might get a garment and wear it as it is for years and then realize you love it and it's falling apart. And you could either take it apart and you basically have a pattern to make future versions, or you can actually, one thing I teach is to make a pattern from an existing garment. So you could do that. And I've actually done that for a lot of people who have, I mean, whether it was a vintage garment or a new garment, but they wore it kind of to death and then they want to replace it and they no longer can get it. So I sometimes do cloning, we call it, of old garments. But yeah, it's a great resource to think of thrift stores and vintage stores, because you know, you're not creating new waste. Like the fabric, the textiles we buy to make clothing is kind of like the new area of focus for people who are trying to be conscientious. You know, we're like you kind of referenced it, like if you're making tons of clothes, if you're making 4 or 5 garments a month and buying tons of fabric and then like none of them fit right, or maybe you wear them for a while, or apparently a lot of people sew a lot of clothes and then never wear them, which I don't really understand, but it might be because like they make them really colorful, you know, they see a cute print with like giraffes on it and then they realize like they wouldn't actually wear a dress with giraffes all over it. So, you know, if you're making a bunch of stuff and then it's just going into the waste stream, that's problematic. So at least using garments that already exist that have been discarded is definitely a more conscientious way to use materials. And you're also like, you can often do some revamping and simple alterations and make something that maybe looks not like something you would wear, and easily make it into something you might wear. And it's a good way, like the garment's already made, so you can often just do a little bit and not have to reinvent the wheel, basically. Although, as Louisa and I know, reinventing the wheel is really fun, but it does take time and energy, and it can be a little overwhelming at first.
Awesome, thank you for that. Okay, and Emily asks, what are you most excited about that you're working on or involved with right now? I love that question.
Well, there's a lot of things. I guess I'm excited. The thing that I'm most consumed with right at this moment is sort of learning, like transitioning everything I do to now doing it like this, and sort of learning to teach virtually. So I have mixed feelings about it. I'm not exactly excited, but I've been taking a bunch of virtual classes to kind of help me understand what the experience is like from the other end. And I am getting excited about the many advantages and possibilities that it allows for. So I really love teaching in person. And for a lot of this time, I've just had a hard time wrapping my head around how what I do can happen virtually, because it's so hands-on, and I'm used to like leaning over someone and like just showing them how it's done. And it's mostly just sort of a mental shift. But so I am excited about the possibilities, because it does mean I could teach people all over the world, really. And people who might not have come to a big sewing convention kind of thing that I teach at, or a weird retreat in the woods of New Hampshire, or like, I teach at all sorts of events, but a lot of them, for whatever reason, are not very accessible to people. So it does open up the possibilities in many ways. And then I probably just have about 1 million projects going on that I'm excited about, every single one. And I've been trying to use a lot of this time to try to make some of them get finished, because that's always a good thing.
Yes, love it. And also very relatable about the millions of projects, simultaneous excitements. Oh, and then Derek has, I guess, sort of a response to what you were saying about thrifted or used clothing and reworking that fabric. Derek says, also, I have been reusing fabric lately, sheets and duvet covers and curtains. So much fabric that can be reused. Totally.
Yeah.
I agree. Okay, so I know that we're over our time, but with my shameless mission to get more people making patterns, I have approximately one more question for you, which is, in your brightest, most optimistic vision of the future, how would you like to see pattern making taught in schools, or maybe not in school, but how would that look that would be, even better, even more on point, even more accessible?
Well, I think very simply, if people were just taught to start with their own body and start with themselves, because I've always been sort of a selfish designer, and really from the beginning I only wanted to make things for myself. I'm happy to make things for other people as long as they have similar taste and want to wear the same kind of things I want to make. But so yeah, or really just starting with any body, like an actual body that's a real human that can bend and move and has, arms and legs and stuff. So, or not, but, just an actual existing human. as opposed to a dress form. Yeah, I think that would be my simple answer, is just to start with like a real person's measurements and not abstract, and kind of bring it more to the people, like what you're doing, rather than, have it. I'm kind of down with the fashion industry in general. Like, I feel like I'd rather everyone made their own clothes, or smaller people, like smaller scale production people made clothes all over the place, and you bought your clothes from an actual human that, maybe you go in and they measure you. Like, I'd like to kind of bring it back to old school. I'm sure it's not at all realistic, but since you asked for my ideal imagined fantasy, that's more how it would be.
Beautiful answer, and you never know. Let's hope for that. Okay, so I guess we should sort of close things out. Thank you everybody again for joining. We're so grateful that you're here. If you have further questions, Cal has generously offered up her email, which is cal, @calpatch.com. Again, reminder that if you feel moved to support her work, you could purchase her super awesome book or take some of her amazing classes. You can visit calpatch.com for information on those. Tomorrow, Saturday, September 12th, from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, is our probably last event of the 2020 season for pattern making in public places, and my friend Eleanor is doing a demo called Making a Pattern for a Simple Knit Sweater. So all of you knitters or aspiring knitters, you should definitely come check it out. For more info on future events, which are maybe not going to be any more this year, but maybe next year, you can follow at Pattern Making in Public Places on Instagram. The recording of this video will be up soon on the patternmakinginpublicplaces.com website. And so, Cal, thank you so much for an inspiring, insightful conversation. Is there anything else that you want to add before we wave people away?
Just go for it. Just try making clothes. It's not hard. Probably most of the people watching already do make some clothes, because I think most people that follow either me or you either do or want to, but it's really not that hard. Go for it. And the more you do it, the better you'll get.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cal. Thank you, everybody else. And have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Bye.